So my name is Roy Tomella, and I am from the Flight Standards branch, and providing this webinar this afternoon or this morning to our friends in the West. CASA established a global reporting format implementation working group under the National Runway Safety Group, or the NRSG. The reason we use the NRSG is because it's a runway hazard specific working group established under our state safety program. It's also got broad industry and government participation, including pilots, aircraft and aerodrome operators, CASA and Air Services Australia. Therefore, it's actually focused on controls for the runway safety risks that we're looking to address. And it was appropriate to form a working group from the NRSG to assist CASA in developing the policy for GRF implementation. As I said, I can't see the screen at the moment, but I'm being joined by a couple of the members of the GRF implementation working group, which will be Brian Greaves from AEPA AusAlpa, Jeff Barrett and Mike Healy from Virgin, James Eason from Air Services Australia, and Ken Alcott from Sydney Airport. Now, the goal of today's presentation is to demystify what GRF is, and that it's not too hard to implement or does not require additional resources. So I'll go to the next slide. Just before that, bear with me one sec. Just do the welcome to country, bear with me one moment. And Alana, I'm sorry, I just can't read the content there. Can you please read that out for me?
Sure. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians and knowledge holders of the land on which we meet today, and I would also like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging.
Thanks, Alana. Okay, these are the themes that we'll be covering today. So why do we need the GRF? What is it? What does it actually look like? When do we need to do it? And who do we report to? So this presentation is intended to be interactive. So please ask questions along the way rather than sort of just saving them up till the end, unless they're in the chat. And I will pause after each slide just for any questions coming through. So why do we need it? We're not introducing the GRF because ICAO says so. GRF is addressing a hazard, and that hazard is reduced braking action due to the changes to the runway surface friction. These impact significantly and directly on aircraft landing and takeoff performances and required distances. And GRF addresses that risk. This is a recent example of the impacts of water on a runway. It's not to say that water was the only factor in this incident, but it was a contributing factor. So if we look at the contributing factors and the other factors that increase the risk from the actual report, there's some key wording from these findings, and they are poor braking effectiveness in wet conditions, aircraft overrunning the runway, rainfall impacts landing distance, runway maintenance and corrective action, means to identify water contamination, and reduction in braking action from active rainfall. So as you can see, what we're trying to do is look at all of these safety risks and come up with a methodology to address those, which is the GRF. So what is the GRF? It's effectively about standardising the everything to do with the runway surface. That's in relation to inspection, assessment, reporting. And the reason we're doing that is this results in benefits to pilots who can then determine the braking action, landing and takeoff performance, which can result in additional landing and takeoff distances. So the main aspect about the reporting runways is that we do it in thirds. However, the thirds of the runways is not intended to be an exact science. You can approximate the runway thirds with existing aerodrome infrastructure, such as taxiway and runway intersections. But again, we're not expecting you to go out with a theodolite or a tape measure to precisely measure the thirds of the runway. Once you have your runway broken into thirds, then there is a runway condition code. This is a number that's allocated to the actual runway surface condition. Although it may be counterintuitive, the lower the number, the worse the runway condition is. So actually 6 is for a dry runway and 1 is for a runway with ice. And the way we actually get that runway condition code is by using the runway surface condition. And so you have the main ones in Australia will be wet, slippery wet, and standing water. And I'll address each of those later on. And the final output is a runway condition report. And the bare minimum is, which what Australia requires, is the runway number, the runway condition code, and surface description for each third. So what I'll do is I'll pause there. Are there any questions or comments from the working group before I go on?
Roy, you do have a question from Nick Politis.
Yes, go ahead, Nick.
Hi, Roy, and thank you for the presentation so far. Nick Politis from Melbourne Airport. We're just doing some work around the GRF and the runway condition report. The runway number, just want to stipulate, it is for the runway in use. And in the way of trying to find efficiencies, given that you could potentially have 2 runway numbers, who designates the runway in use? Or can it be done by the ground operator on the ground to say, this is the runway use? Or is it dictated by the pilot, or is it dictated by ATC?
Right.
It's a little bit unclear.
Yeah.
We appreciate your support on that, or feedback on that.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Great question, Nick, actually, because there is a requirement for the runway condition report. It's the lower runway number, whether it's in use or not. So if it was 019, you'd be reporting as an aerodrome operator on runway 01. However, from an ATC perspective, and what goes on the automatic terminal information service, that is the actual runway in use. So if it was runway 19 due to the winds, etc., then ATC on the ATIS would be reporting runway 19. But for the aerodrome operator, if they are going to do a runway condition report, it's always the lower runway number, so never a change for them. Does that make that clearer, Nick?
Thank you, Roy. So just to replay that one, for the aerodrome operator, when we're required to report the GRF, we'll be reporting from the lower runway number.
Correct.
Thank you.
Roy, there's a question in the chat. Do you want to deal with that one now because it's appropriate?
Yeah, I'm happy to take them as we go along. It's just that I think they won't see them hear them in the recording, but if you read it out, that'll be great.
I'll read the first one from Jandakot Airport. The question is a Class D aerodrome still considered as a controlled aerodrome when the tower is closed and Class G airspace is in place? An example is the GRF reporting required during Class G airspace or only when the tower is operational?
That's another great question. And the answer is when there's the ATC present or the tower is manned, then it's considered a controlled aerodrome according to the GRF requirements. When ATC are not there, then it does revert to a non-controlled airdrome, and so the reporting requirements, etc., for wet runways doesn't exist. It's back to the same as any other certified airdrome. So the short answer being it's not considered controlled airdrome if ATC is not present.
You have a hand up from Cam Mikhail.
Go Cam.
Hi Roy, it's actually Pavel Davidiak from Perth Airport. We are just using Cam's.
Okay, fine.
Just to follow up, like, you know, on Nick's question from Melbourne Airport and your response on the what's expected to be reported from airport operators, the lowest number, and then what's the runway in use. So it's quite clear, but just like for clarity, all right. So we reported, like, let's say we'll report the lower number of the runway for the code, for the runway code, but then the ATC uses a different runway. So it's not contradicting.
No. So from a standardization perspective, it's an airdrome operator won't necessarily have access to the ATIS or know what the operational runway in use is. That's why from an airdrome operator perspective, they just keep to the standard lower runway number. However, pilots will actually receive that from the ATIS, which will be the runway in use. So effectively, the reporting of it is reversed. So as that same example, runway 01, if that was 552, then if it was reported from the opposite direction, then it would be 255, which does sound complicated, but again, it's in the implementation of this. Certainly ATC are trained and familiar with providing the ATIS automatically and also via voice over the radio, but this will be in the transition that it's clear to ATC and in their procedures that they're reporting from the runway in use, whether it's the lower or the higher number. Sometimes it'll be the same, but from an airdrome operator perspective, to be very plain and simple, it's always the lower runway number.
Okay, thank you. And then on your previous content on the 1/3 of the runway and the measurement, so with the 1/3, so where exactly do you expect us to measure? So is it just like, because you know that we might measure in one location of that 1/3 the water depths, but then it might be different water depths at different location of that 1/3. It's a little bit controversial as well. So, and then I don't think that we can achieve the correct readings.
Are you saying that there'll be two different water depths on 1/3 of a runway?
Well, it might be, right?
Yes.
So because of the obviously asphalt or concrete, depends what runway you have, right? So it might be, I don't know, the slope of the runway. So there are different contributing factors. So it's, so we see that it's also might be risk as well. So what's CASA position on that?
So we'll go into a lot of more detail about that reporting, but effectively, if you had two amounts of standing water, which qualifies for reporting, which is more than 25% of a third, then whichever is the deepest water is what would be reported in the runway condition report. Same as if a pilot has got three different runway condition codes, such as 553, in their FMS, which again I'll talk about later, they would use the most demanding runway surface condition, which would be the 2, or the 3 rather. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thank you so much.
That's all right, but I'll go into a bit more detail about that reporting of the runways. Any more questions?
Yeah, there's two more. There's Matt and then Balmu, and I'm wondering if we should stop with the two questions and then continue and see if we can come back to more questions later on. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, that's fine.
Matthew Bender, please.
Thanks, and thanks, Roy. And let me know if this is touched on later. So probably in addition to Pavel's question with consistency. So if the lower runway number is the default reporting runway, and then you're looking at the thirds there, if you've got a displaced threshold, the affected third may actually be different depending on which runway you're looking at. So is that touched on later, or is that something we need to?
That is it's a bit more complicated. I won't say it's complex, but we've got a multi-part AC, which does actually have that sort of a diagram for displaced thresholds.
I don't know. I understand the.
Yeah.
Sorry,
yeah.
I understand the layout in terms of how it
Yes.
would be reported, but in terms of the lower runway third being, sorry, the lower runway number being referenced.
Yes.
When you're applying the thirds, bear with me. I don't want to take up too much time.
No,
We
that's
can talk
fine.
about it later. If you've got a displaced threshold, the affected runway third may be different because you're
correct.
doing the TORA based on either runway heading, if you know what I mean.
Understood.
So maybe for us, for example, you're referencing runway 14 as the lower runway number, but if the runway third in question that's most affected by the contaminant is judged on the other runway layout, that may be different. I mean, we can talk about that later. I don't want to take too much time.
Yeah, that's a good example. And from my perspective, because of the standard reporting from a lower runway number, which could then obviously be the operational runway in use on the reciprocal end, I would be reporting just the physical length of the runway in thirds. And for the displaced thresholds, I wouldn't be trying to get too complex with displaced thresholds, because you don't know which is the direction in use. So you can't really, from an aerodrome operator perspective, say, oh, this is going to be the runway with a displaced threshold, because you won't know that. So you should just report the physical runway length in thirds for the lower runway number.
Okay, all right. Thanks.
And then we have another question from Belmu Perus, please. I hope I said that right.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can.
Yes, I just got a quick one. The runway condition code, where would we find that?
Okay, so what we have is the regulations, and I will talk about this a bit later too, but the regulations actually have the runway condition codes in the Part 139 MOS amendment, which is now the compilation version of the MOS is now on the ComLaw website. And yes, so the runway condition codes for both dry, wet, slippery, wet and standing water runways and the other contaminated runways are all available in the MOS changes for Part 139, but they're also in our multi-part advisory circular, which I'll reference later on.
All right, thanks for that. Yep.
All right, I'll continue now. As I said, we're not too running pretty well according to time. One thing to note, it's only importantly, you only need to report if there are known airplane operations. So again, if there's no airplanes are operating that you're aware of as an airdrome, then there's no AROs need to be sitting there all night waiting for it to rain or what have you. So there's no requirement to have additional staff if you are not aware of any aircraft that are operating. This isn't as relevant for controlled airlines, which are necessarily busy, as that's why they're established. But as we've heard, you do have situations overnight and potentially on weekends when ATC is no longer present, and they are just treated as non-controlled certified airdromes. And again, if the ATC is not present and the airdrome operator is not aware of any traffic, which is scheduled or notified in advance, etc., then you don't need to have staff sitting there waiting for rain or standing water to develop. Yeah, I'll leave it there. I'll just move on.
Mate, howdy.
Thank you.
How you going, all right? Good. You got
Good.
diesel delivery yesterday? Did they turn up?
Yes, late.
We just got someone's microphone is off mute. We just need to mute it. Thanks. Okay. So talking about the runway condition code, which we just had a question about, the runway condition code relates to the actual description of that third of a surface. And also each number, that's 6532, which I'll describe in the next slide, actually equates to a pilot braking action. And because of the relatively benign weather conditions in Australia, we have broken up the runway condition code for wet and dry conditions and for snow and ice conditions. So on this slide, you can see that the predominant ones in Australia will be, dry, wet, slippery wet, or standing water as being the main contaminant, if indeed that is the case. As I'll talk about, there are several mitigators that actually prevent standing water from collecting. And these are the most prevalent conditions for our 330 certified airdromes. Again, it's not meant to be an exact science, and ICAO says that visual observation is okay. So you don't actually have sophisticated measuring equipment if it's raining, or if you do have standing water, visual observation is okay. But I'm going to repeat this a few times, it's important for an airdrome operator to know your own runway or runways. So, you have your airdrome, your runway, which is designed, built, should have transverse slopes to prevent water pooling and ponding or poor drainage. And so it's important that, and there's also runway serviceability inspections which also check for ponding and pooling and poor drainage. So you should know if there are significant periods of rain, if water, and which is again greater than 25% of a runway 30 if there's pooling of water. So if you do know that, or you should know that as an airdrome operator. So as I said, this is how the runway condition code relates to braking action, and this is why it's important that pilots need to know what this number is. So although it may be counterintuitive, but the higher the number, the better the runway condition. Or the surface conditions. So 6 is a dry runway, and as I said, 0 is where the braking action is less than poor. Pretty unlikely in Australian circumstances, but we can get down to 2 for standing water, or 3 for a runway that is slippery wet. And having said that, it is possible, and we do mention this in the advisory circular, is that if you have a wet runway but you're getting pilot reports that the braking action isn't good, it's actually deteriorated to good to medium, a report can be issued to say that the actual runway condition code is 4, not 5. So it's about using this as a tool to properly inform a pilot of the condition of the runway surface.
Roy, there's a question in the chat.
Yeah.
That's relevant to this, and I just want to make sure that we've addressed that.
Mm-hmm.
So Thomas asked and said that the advisory circular discusses the changing of the runway condition code due to contaminants, and it also touches on the changing of the runway condition due to pilot reporting of runway braking. So the question is, in the event that there's 2 or more pilots reporting runway braking issues, and however there's no contaminants or inadequate amounts of contaminants present, does the runway condition code still require to be changed?
Great question, and I would suggest that yes, that is the case. So again, it's about telling the pilots what the runway surface condition is, and one of the ways we determine that a runway is slippery wet and not wet is based on the pilots reporting that the braking action is medium and not good. So if an airdrome operator or ATC controlled airdromes are getting those pilot reports that the braking action is less than would be expected for that runway surface, then indeed the report should be issued for that lower number being, instead of a 5 being a 4 or even a 3 potentially. So yes, use the reports from pilots who this is intended for to appropriately, downgrade or even upgrade the other way if necessary, the runway condition report. Any other questions? I'll move on.
There's another question. I think you're going to get to it, but I'll read it now so we can address it. It came from Stephen, and it says that the multi-part advisory circular appears to contain contradictory information about the lowest number, and it's not set, but for the runway. And it then quotes the paragraph 3.2.1 from the advisory circular, where it indicates the lower runway designation number at controlled aerodromes. This will be the runway designator for the runway number broadcast on the ATIS.
Yes. Correct. Yeah, so that's going back to what we said previously. Is the number at ATC will be the number broadcast on the ATIS, which will be either the lower or the higher number, depending on what the runway in use is. So, yeah, again, I can't remember the exact wording, but the wording in the AC is intended to reflect that in a few places. So, without any doubt, the airdrome operator, lower runway number, ATC, it's the runway number in use. I'll move on. Hopefully that addresses that one. So here is what it looks like for a pilot. Now all of these diagrams that are in these slides are in the multi-part AC, and if I can pass on this, there is a aviation company that provides training, and they are providing some GRF training, and they are using some of the artwork and diagrams from the AC as for their part of their training courses, which is good to hear and certainly how we want it to be used. So this is a fairly smart FMS. So this is a multi-function control display unit. As you can see, it has the capability of putting in the runway condition code number, which to a pilot is translated to the braking action on the right-hand side there. So 4 is good to medium. And then automatically it will come up with a landing data safety factor of 1.15, etc. So you can see how directly applicable this is to an aircraft with a FMS that's capable of putting in the runway condition code directly. However, even with an aircraft that doesn't have that sort of capability, a lot of the AFMs, or the aeroplane flight manuals, will actually have performance data that specifies the actual runway condition code number from 6 to 0, etc. So it's not that you can put it in the FMS, but you can do the calculations based on the runway condition code. And finally, from a human factors perspective, even if you're not very familiar with what the runway condition code number means, the fact that you have for each third the runway surface description, whether it's potentially dry, wet, or slippery, wet, or standing water, that actually tells a pilot from a human factors perspective what is the runway surface condition. And in the past, there's been a lot of talk that this should only be for Part 121 operators, etc. But under all of the aircraft operations rules, 91, 121 and 135, pilots need to take into account the runway surface conditions. So this is important even for a GA pilot, as well as a large air transport operator. Just pausing there. So we're about halfway through. So I think we're about halfway through the slide. So in theory, we're on track. Now, it's important to note that not everything has changed. There's some requirements that basically are already there to assist you in conducting these inspections and reports. So there is a current requirement for a serviceability inspection after heavy winds, storms, or heavy rain. And this isn't just about poor weather or water on the runway. It's also about winds blowing in foreign object debris or other runway damage. So this serviceability inspection is required whenever that event happens, and not just if you've got aircraft operations that you know about. However, it is the most likely event to cause standing water. The other thing we've introduced is where you've already likely got a runway condition report, and there are meteorological conditions which cause the code number to change, which could be from a 5 to a 4 or a 3, or the surface becomes contaminated, or that contaminant changes. Again, it's in Australian circumstances, and I'll go into this a little bit later, but it's more than likely the contaminant is going to be standing water. Slippery, wet runways, which we'll talk about as well, are not a contaminant, but they're just simply hazardous because of the lack of runway surface friction. But that second one, that inspection is only required if you've got known aeroplane operations. So if this is maybe you've got some rain that's coming in that doesn't meet the other triggers, and you don't have any aircraft operating, then you don't have to have the AROs sitting out there reporting. So no additional staff required for that one. When we're doing the serviceability inspections, all we've added is that you should check for the things that actually lead to runway surface condition reporting. So the definition of wet is visible dampness, and then the other standing water, snow, slush, etc., are contaminants. The other current requirement for runway serviceability inspections is for pooling or ponding of water. The only thing we've added that is for poor drainage, which is also likely to cause pooling or ponding of water. So these are things that are already happening that you just need to consider the RCR or runway condition reporting elements. And the MET conditions that we've added is only for known aeroplane operations. So if you don't have any aircraft operating, you don't have to have staff out there. This is the slide I was talking about, the runway third. So as you can see from, and this is again from the advisory circular, if you see the picture there, that's just approximating the runway thirds for those intersecting runways. The breakup on the right-hand side of that picture shows how to report a contaminated runway if it is considered contaminated, which is greater than 25% of that third, or if it's less than or equal to 25%. So ICAO expects that if a runway is contaminated, but it's less than or equal to 25% of a third, that you don't have to report it and it's considered as a dry runway. We don't believe, or we've got input from our pilots and aircraft operators and airlines, etc., that if a runway is contaminated and it's less than 25% or equal to 25% of a third, then we report that as wet with a runway condition code of 5. So it's still, and these are in the margins, these examples, and it's unlikely to happen on a regular basis, but this is where we're saying know your runway. I'll mention it again a bit later on, but know your runway and record all of this in your airdrome manual. So if these circumstances of weather events occur, then you can actually be prepared to roll out your runway condition report. And if there is any doubt about the margins, just over report. It's better to report something if you're not sure whether it's 25% or 35%, then you should be reporting that third of a runway. Now, this is the most typical scenario. This is wet runways are only required to be reported at a controlled airdrome if ATC is present. So you can see the example here of the report. It's only from the ATIS, and that's a standard ATIS, which has now got the runway condition report as part of it, which is runway 34, which is obviously the higher number because, that's what we've said, because it's the operational runway, the higher number is reported. Runway surface condition code, 555, wet, 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 and then the wind, etc. And if the ATC was providing that over the radio, that bottom line is how they would report it. Now, it's vitally important to remember that no TAMs are not issued for wet runways. So they're only reported at controlled airdromes. This is why CASA highly recommends that controlled airdrome operators, including the Class D controlled airdromes, any controlled airdromes where ATC is present, that by the 1st of August that you have your agreement in place with ATC to report the wet and dry runways. That's currently the case, and we would like that to continue, because if you're a controlled airdrome and you don't have this agreement with ATC, when it is raining, you'll need an ARO there to monitor the runway and report that to ATC as the runway is wet and drying, whereas the ATC can do that from the control tower, where they're already trained to do that in their selection of runway in use. Apart from this webinar, which is directed at controlled airdromes and certified airdromes with Part 121 operations, we've also directly emailed every controlled airdrome operator last week to encourage them to have those agreements in place with ATC. And as I said, the report on the wet runway is provided by the ATIS or ATC directly. I see there's a question in the chat. I can't read the whole thing.
It's a question from Yoni. It says that I understand that Air Services have developed an LOA template regarding the GRF reporting during ATC hours. Do Air Services ATC have this template already? And
Yes.
is the template only relevant for the GRF, which is then incorporated into a pre-existing LOA?
Right. That's a good question. I do have James Eason from Air Services with us, but I'll just attempt to answer that in that, yes, there's a draft LOA that incorporates the reporting of wet runways, and that should be controlled aerodrome should contact their, if you like, tower supervisor at the controlled aerodrome, and that can be part of an agreement that contains other matters, not just the reporting of wet, dry runways. Is that correct, James?
Yeah, that's right. It can be incorporated into the existing LOA just with a new section.
Thank you. I'll keep moving.
You have a hand up from Pavel.
Mm-hmm.
Pavel, please.
Pavel?
Hear me?
Yes, I hear you. Yeah, but with an echo.
Sorry about that. Just like, to follow up on that letter of agreement with Air Services, maybe James would be better in position to answer the question. So we're already in the process of amending our letter. And then my understanding is that Air Services will only report runway code 5. But what would happen if, for example, due to work health and safety concerns, as per the advisory circular, we can't do the runway code reporting? Would be Air Services the one who we can delegate that authority?
I'll answer it quickly, and then James perhaps can jump in. But so what we're talking about here is if you have an agreement with ATC, they'll report the wet and dry runways. If you believe that because of lightning in the area, you're going to have standing water on a runway 30, is that the situation?
Well, you know that there can be different situations, right? So it can be lighting or thunderstorm over the airfield. So then it's a work healthy concern, obviously, to send our personnel to do this runway code reporting. But then maybe it's still not the standing water, so it might need to change from that code 5 to code 3, right? So yeah, so it's what's discussion CASA and Air Services had on that.
Thanks, Pavel, I think it was. So James, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so we've got in our procedures some phraseology for prefixing any advice to aircraft with tower observes. So if the aerodrome operator for WHS regions is unable to make an assessment, we can still see from the tower cab, obviously, as we do today. If there's standing water mid-runway or something like that, we wouldn't report it in the GRF format, so we wouldn't give it a runway condition code. We would just use plain language prefixed with tower observes.
Thanks, James. I'll keep moving because we are 20 minutes left. I've still got a couple of slides to get through. Now, slippery wet runways, they're not contaminated. They have their own definition, which we have in the MOS, but they're a particular hazard due to the impacts of the reduced runway surface friction. These are the only situations where the percentage of a runway thirds are to be reported if there's pilot reports of the braking action being medium. So you're reporting a runway third as being either 25, 50, 75 or 100% of that third being slippery wet. And that's where we've got that example of the runway 09 with the 3 being the runway condition code for a slippery wet runway, and then 55. So it's 25% or less of the runway third is slippery wet. So it's 25 and then not reported. And this is where we've gone a bit better than ICAO. We actually use the wording slippery wet. Under ICAO, the runway surface condition for a slippery wet runway is still wet, the same as a rain-affected runway, the only difference being instead of being a runway condition code of 5, a slippery wet runway has a 3. So we're doing a bit better than ICAO, we believe. So from a human factors perspective, we're reporting that the runway's slippery wet. I guess the important thing is, again, in this one, we don't want to sort of over-report it, but it is important for the pilots to know, exactly what part of that is slippery wet. Jeff Barrett, are you online? Did you want to add anything to that?
Nothing to add, but it's probably a good time to ask the question. Just in relation to how aerodromes report slippery wet runways and the relationship with the friction levels. So if part of the runway is measured to be below the minimum friction level, currently aerodromes will report that as a NOTAM. And I guess I'm curious to see, will aerodromes report these portions as slippery wet by default, or will that only occur if the aerodrome reports pilot reported braking action that's below expected?
Thanks, Jeff. I'm not sure if there's any of our aerodrome operators that want to take that one on, or we can do that as a follow-up potentially. I'll just wait to see if any of the aerodromes want to answer that one. So what I'll say about that, Jeff, is again a good point, because we only want to be reporting runways that are slippery wet, and not just because they don't meet the friction requirements. So serviceability inspections currently are required to check for buildup of rubber or other contaminants which may reduce surface friction. So these are the, of the safety system, these are the mitigators. You've got the serviceability inspections, not just for pooling and ponding of water, but also for a buildup of rubber and other contaminants, which could lead to slippery wet runways. And runways are also required to be maintained in accordance with the surface texture or friction standards. So that there are mitigators in place, unless you know your runway. So if you know your runway from previous experience, when it gets a certain amount of rain or water, it becomes slippery wet, because pilots have reported that. You should be familiar enough to potentially have a runway condition report in your aerodrome manual that you can roll out under those circumstances, rather than going out in those weather conditions.
We have a comment from Brett Fraser. I think he wants to add to this, and then we have a question from Bob.
Okay.
I just wanted to clarify something. The way that I was going to handle it, if we get a report that from the friction testing that for a certain third there's the friction coefficient isn't compliant, it's less than it should be, then at the moment we put out a NOTAM that has information on it that maybe the pilots can't really use.
Yes.
So the way I was going to handle that was that even though the runway was dry, I was going to call that as wet in that third. And then if it rained, I would call it slippery wet.
Yeah, look, that's certainly erring on the side of safety. And I guess to Jeff's point, it's the pilots reporting a runway as contaminated has a great impact on aeroplane performance, and also on landing safety factors and takeoff safety factors. So we don't want to sort of compromise operation on a runway if it's not actually slippery wet, if you can see what I'm saying. So what I would urge again is to know your runway. In those circumstances, I will be looking to talk to ATC and get maybe some talk to them, if you've got a local runway safety team, about conditions that lead to slippery wet runway surfaces or portions of it, and having that data, if possible, from airlines or pilots who are actually reporting the braking action as being medium instead of good. So rather than just doing that because the surface coefficient is less than what it should be, or then because you've got water on it, I'd in that circumstance be a bit more careful, because it could restrict unduly aircraft or aeroplane operations.
I saw Jeff's hand come up after. Jeff, did you want to add more to the previous comment before we go to Bob's question?
Yeah, just to follow on from Brett's comments. So just two things. The current NOTAMs in the format that they're currently published, we do utilize those. They're actually quite valuable because they contain a lot of information, and we can perform a desktop assessment and then provide guidance onto our pilots for the operation. So the current way it's done is actually quite useful for us. I would tend to agree with Roy's comments just around not being overly conservative, and I guess more relying on the actual pilot reported braking action as to whether it's slippery or not is our sort of view on it. Yeah, thank you.
We've got 12 minutes left. I've still got a few slides, so I'm not sure if we're...
I'm worried that Bob has been really patient.
Yeah. Oh, I thought Bob had a question previously. Bob? Is that an old hand? Not that I can see it.
No, I'm here live, Roy. Good day.
Well done, Bob.
Thank you. Reference your comment about direct email to controlled aerodrome operators. We indeed got that for our Alice Springs aerodrome and are making arrangements with the tower supervisor there about an LOA.
Right. Yep.
But I don't recall that we got an email for Darwin, and as you know,
yes,
Darwin's a joint user airfield with Defence Air Traffic Control, and we did have some dialogue earlier in the year about basically Defence not participating in this, and certainly for Darwin there was limited capacity in the ATIS and perhaps not enough capacity to have the runway condition codes. I don't know if you've had any more discussion with Defence, Roy.
No, well that's a good point, and I think it's still okay for them to do a limited reporting, which is if it's going to be the whole runway. So, but yet there's been no LOA with Defence yet for that reporting of wet runways.
Okay, thanks.
No, has there been a LOA with Darwin?
Negative.
All right.
No.
If you leave that with us for Darwin and Townsville, we'll reach out to Defence, make sure that's in place before the 1st of August.
Yeah, thanks, Roy.
Do you have time for one more question from Quentin?
I'm running a little bit. I'm not sure about the legality of this running overtime. We've got about 10 minutes. I've got about probably 7 sort of slides with a bit more meat in them. I'm happy to go over time, but I'm not sure if that's allowed under the rules of engagement with webinars. Alana, is that?
That's totally fine, Roy.
Okay, thanks. All right, so I'll take one more question and I'll move on.
Yeah, you got me?
Yes, I've got you.
Yeah, look, just with regional airports, small airports that are run by councils and everything, and I'm a primary ARO and I got released and they released me in other jobs. Yep. When it comes to when it rains, you've got like either Qantas or Rex that are flying in from a dry climate to a wet climate. I've read a lot of this, and to make it simplified and to make it easier, when we've got a runway, and with our runway, it's not too bad. There's a little ponding in certain areas, but less than 25%.
Yep.
Basically, we're talking to the AROs is that we put a NOTAM out that says wet, wet, wet at 5, because that basically tells the small aircrafts that are coming in from dry climates that we have got a wet runway, and they can actually be prepared for any braking that needs to be that happens with the runway being wet. So what I'm trying to do is make it simplified for AROs and not get too technical, because it goes into a lot of depth, and I'm just trying to make it easier and safer for aviation.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I know that Air Services would be interested in the response to that in terms of NOTAM office, etc. So I have been considering this. So what we're talking about, we don't do NOTAMs for wet runways because there's obviously too many occasions for that. But what we're talking about with a slight amount of pooling is we're talking about a runway that's actually contaminated, but not to the extent that the contamination is reported as a if I say as a 2 for standing water. What you're actually reporting is a contaminated runway less than 25% as wet. So on that basis, that you're actually putting out an RCR through the NOTAM office for a contaminated runway from a legal perspective and a Part 139 MOS perspective. I think that'll be okay, but not if it's just simply wet, but if there's an element of contamination, which is standing water.
What happens if you just got the whole lot of your runway and you've like it's been resealed and everything like that, and you do have dispersions into it?
Sorry, you're breaking up. I missed that last part of that.
Yeah, when you've got, say, your runway and in different areas, you've just got little ponding spots. Which
I think if I'm guessing what you're going to say next was, what if the runway, although not standing water, was completely covered in water during a heavy storm? we have to take each runway on a case-by-case basis, but as I said, the aerodrome operator should know their runway. The idea behind the GRF is we're reporting hazards, and if this runway is hazardous, perhaps because it's got the rain and it's actually going to go down to a runway condition code of 4 because the braking action is not going to be good, then that would warrant a runway condition report. I'm not sure if someone's trying to enter the meeting, but I'm getting some pinging in my headsets. All right, I'll probably move on from there. I know there's one question in the, there's a question about non-controlled aerodromes. So remember that this is the webinar for controlled aerodromes, and there are some non-controlled aerodromes with Part 121 scheduled operations, but we're going to be running another one of these more so for the regional or the remaining non-controlled aerodromes later on this year. And if this is of any value, if I can speak for our comms team, and we can potentially run more of these webinars if they are useful to industry, whether they're pilots or aircraft operators or airdromes, etc. So I'll keep going. Now, this is the most likely source of runway contamination in Australia. The top one is basically the basic format, which is just the runway number, the code numbers, runway condition code 255, standing water, wet. And that would be reported by the aerodrome operator to ATC if it was there, or to the NOTAM office. And you do as I said, the runway condition code reporting in runway thirds. The bottom one says includes the depth, and we've talked about depth previously, where you might have 2 bits of standing water on a runway third that qualify for reporting. You would be reporting the deepest one. And I'm saying this again, know your runway. You don't have to be out there in the middle of a storm. If you've got significant rain conditions, no aircraft operations, you should be familiar enough with your runway that you could go out, do your measurements. You could actually have that runway condition report pretty much ready to go in your aerodrome manual as a template, which I'll go into a bit later. And so every time it rains, that amount of water, be it 25 mils or what have you, then you would know that you could quite safely, because it's not rocket science, issue that runway condition report even for depth if you had that measured and available in your aerodrome manual. Again, you don't have to do this if there aren't any aircraft operations that you're aware of. So unless it's a control tower during the control tower hours of operation. Now, this is a simple diagram, again, from our multi-part advisory circular. So on the left-hand side, wet runways are only reported at controlled airdromes, but not if there's an agreement in place with ATC, which is CASA's preferred option. And the other surface conditions are reported to both ATC, only if they're present, and the NOTAM office. One enhancement we've got, again, which is potentially better than ICAO. So at non-controlled airdromes or outside the hours of tower operations, if there is a NOTAM issued, which is a runway condition report, ATC will provide that to any aircraft operating to that location as part of their flight information service. So in effect, pilots are getting a service similar to a controlled airdrome when there's a runway condition report for a contaminated or slippery wet runway. And only if aircraft operators, have Unicom or CAGRIS, they can use these to report to pilots directly if the staff are trained, because they're already reporting numerous things on the Unicom. CAGRIS is probably not so relevant these days because I don't know that there's actually any airdromes left with a CAGRIS. They're pretty much not in operation anymore. But if you've got Unicom, you can report that directly to pilots if you've got a contaminated runway report. Any questions coming in there, Louise?
Negative.
Okay, so this is the training. So the Part 139 MOS changes does require the AROs to be trained to conduct the GRF serviceability inspections and the reports. We believe there's a wealth of material in our multi-part AC, and also if you go into that AC, we have a template for reporting wet runways, wet and standing water runways at the back of the AC, but inside the body of the AC, we actually have the links to the ICAO templates for runway surface assessments and reporting, both for wet and dry runways and for the ones that experience ice and snow. The AC has also got a training syllabus if you want to do your own training course. And then we've also got the links to the ICAO e-learning and online training. Now, this is provided at the aerodrome operators would have to pay for each of their staff. Last time I looked recently, it was $150 US, and that was for the e-learning. I think the online training was slightly more, but it was a bit more extensive. So there is training available, but the AC, I think, should be your first stop. And if you haven't already, I would certainly get your AROs and reporting officers familiar with that multi-part AC. It's coming up to 3 o'clock. Only a couple of slides left, so I'll keep going. If you can't stay any longer, then I hope this has been of some use to you, but I'll continue. The other requirements, as I've mentioned quite often, is the aerodrome manual. So that, from a Part 139 MOS perspective, needs to have procedures for conducting the GRF serviceability inspections and reports. And we recommend that you have common runway condition report and NOTAM examples in your manual. Again, I'm just going to reiterate, you should know your own runway, and you can measure the water depth after a storm when the runway is not in use. But the other mitigators that we've got, as I've said again before, are the design and maintenance of runways are intended to prevent pooling, ponding, or poor drainage of water. I can see a question about CASA and AAA doing an e-learning module. Certainly, I will take that as a comment because I wouldn't like to commit either CASA or the AAA at this stage, but it is a good idea and something that we can look at. Runway maintenance, again, the GRF is a system. So you've got runway surface inspections, assessments, reporting, but we've linked via notes and other means the runway serviceability inspections to whether or not pooling or ponding or poor drainage of water is discovered. And if that is the case, then you're directed to Chapter 18 and you are required to undertake remedial action as soon as possible, but we're not expecting through a note that the runways are going to be resealed or overlaid. This is intended to address depressions and surface irregularities that can come from, rutting from the depressions caused by, tyres, etc., and which commonly appear on either side of the centre line potentially. But again, it's about knowing your runway. There is meant to be some maintenance carried out if this pooling or ponding is evident. But again, we're not saying you have to completely overdo the whole runway. Does that say, I've got a couple of questions there, so I might pause if people are staying on. Is anyone exiting the meeting or are they all staying glued to their seats?
There's a couple of people that left, but we have a question about the implementation date for controlled aerodromes. Is that still the 1st of August?
Yes, it is.
Second question is, will the CASA sample aerodrome manual part 139 template document be updated to include the GRF content?
Very good question, and the answer is yes. I was recently in touch with the team that was updating not just the sample aerodrome manual, but the manual assessment and authoring tool, which is being used by a lot of aerodromes, and we are updating that to include content for the GRF.
Does that also include the standard aerodrome inspection checklist?
That I'm not aware of, but again, if that covers off the things that are in the Part 139 MOS that require inspection, and that now includes the GRF elements or other things such as poor drainage, then yes, that should be updated as well.
You can continue.
Thank you. Now, this isn't meant to be flippant, but what we're trying to address through this presentation and the guidance material, it's not so hard. So runway serviceability inspections are already required after bad weather. So this isn't new. Wet runways don't need to be reported if you've got an agreement with ATC at a controlled aerodrome. Snow and ice are very rare. We do have information regarding the runway condition reports, so you can still do that, but they are rare, and the number of aerodromes that are affected by that at this time of year are quite insignificant. There's only maybe 2 or 3. And if in any doubt about the contamination of the runway with snow or ice, then it can be closed. The only other one that's probably not as serious but fits into that sort of category is frost, which is experienced by some of our runways that are in our colder climates but not snow bound. Frost is considered like a wet runway with a runway condition code of 5. So again, depending on how long your runway is likely to have frost on it, the AC does have a particular diagram of how you would report that, and that can go into your airdrome manual. So what we're left with for most of the time, the most common contaminant in Australia will be standing water. As I've said, the mitigators are the runway design with the transverse slopes and the maintenance to prevent pooling and ponding. You only have to do the visual observation for the standing water. You don't have to have high-tech measuring equipment. Again, your runway should be known to you, so you should know if there's a significant or certain amount of rain, whether it's likely to have enough standing water that requires to be reported. And again, put the sample runway condition report or NOTAM into your airdrome manual so you can roll it out if those weather conditions are prevailing. So the transitions, as we said, 1st of August next month for controlled aerodromes, all those certified aerodromes with scheduled Part 121 operations. And then the remaining certified aerodromes is 1st of February next year. And as I said, we'll be doing another webinar probably later this year for those aerodromes. But the way the reg changes are written, you have to implement on those dates, but you can implement by those dates. So you can implement whenever you're ready. So we're coming pretty much, so this, again, this graphic is not meant to be, say that GRF is child's play, but what we've got are linkages between runway surface inspection and assessment. This then gets reported to pilots, and pilots can take that into account for landing and takeoff performance. Therefore, the GRF components are linked together to ensure the and safeguard runway operations. So that sort of brings us to the conclusion. So I hope this webinar has demystified the GRF or the global reporting format. It's not so hard. You won't need extra staff, and it's incumbent on aerodrome operators, know the runway condition of their runway surface. So if there is time, if there's any other questions, I'm happy to take those. Or if there's anyone else who wants to make any comments from the National Runway Safety Group or working group or any other comments, I'm happy to listen to those.
Philip Clark, please.
Hi, Philip. Are you there, Philip?
We can't hear you, Philip, sorry.
Yeah, I've just gone back to the Teams meeting. So you got your hand up, Philip, but we can't hear you if you're talking. Your microphone isn't muted, but we can't hear you. If there's no other questions or comments, I'll probably wrap it up since we're a little bit over time. I'd like to just thank everyone for attending. I'd like to thank the members of the National Runway Safety Group, GRF Implementation Working Group for their support and their suggestions, which was a whole of industry collaboration, if I can say that. We had the input from the pilots, the airlines, aircraft operators and airdrome operators and ATC and the NOTAM office, CASA, etc., to actually determine that we got this policy right. We believe it's a measured approach and is consistent or with Australia's relatively benign weather conditions, but addressing the risk of too much water on the runway surface, which impacts aircraft operations. So hopefully this has been of value to you, and I appreciate your attendance and your attention. Thank you.